driver takes a car onto a busy highway, we expect a catastrophic crash, yet we hand the unfiltered engine of social media to billions of adults across the developing world without a single driving lesson. In India, vigilante mobs murdered over 40 innocent people in a single 12-month span, and the spark for those killings was often nothing more than a forwarded WhatsApp message. We are looking at a thesis put forward by writer Mustafa Sajjad Haider, who asks a rather blunt question: is social media evil? Haider argues that while we obsess over the digital safety of children, the true destructive force lies with adults, particularly in the developing world, who have been given unfettered access to radicalizing content without the critical tools to navigate it. The result is a wildfire of religious extremism, political violence, and mob justice. Joining me to dissect this theory is Oliver. We hear about the dangers social media poses to teenagers quite often, but Haider deliberately pivots away from that demographic. He states that kids are mostly guided by parents and teachers, whereas adults are left unsupervised.
Haider hits on a structural vulnerability that most Western tech companies did not anticipate. When platforms like Facebook and WhatsApp expanded globally, they operated under the assumption that their user base possessed a baseline level of digital literacy. In North America and Europe, the internet evolved gradually. People went from dial-up desktop computers to early message boards, and eventually to algorithmic social feeds. There was a learning curve. In much of the global south, entire populations leapfrogged desktop computers and landlines altogether. They went from having no internet access straight to a smartphone, where the internet was synonymous with a social media feed. Haider uses the analogy of putting an untrained driver behind the wheel on a busy motorway. You are handing a powerful, high-speed machine to someone who has never been taught how to read the road signs.
The driving analogy is striking, but let us look closer at the mechanics of that machine. If someone lacks digital literacy, why does that translate to violence or religious extremism? A lack of education could just as easily lead to falling for financial scams, which it certainly does, but Haider specifically warns about people calling each other heretics and forming rapid, unscrutinized mobs.
The architecture of these platforms is built to prioritize emotional resonance over factual accuracy. Algorithms categorize content based on engagement, and anger is the most reliable driver of human engagement. When you combine that technical design with a user base that has not been trained to verify digital sources, the consequences are severe. A United Nations Development Program report from 2021 found that over 40% of communal violence incidents in Bangladesh over a 5-year period were triggered by social media posts. The content is often a manufactured rumor, a fake image of a religious text being desecrated, or a false claim about child kidnappers. Because the platform delivers this information seamlessly, it bypasses traditional communal scrutiny.
That bypass mechanism is critical. Before social media, a rumor had to travel by word of mouth. It would face friction. Someone in the village square might question the source, or local authorities could intervene before the anger reached a boiling point.
The friction has been removed. We can look at the tragic events in Myanmar to see this dynamic play out on a national scale. An investigation by Amnesty International concluded that Meta, specifically through Facebook, played a substantial role in facilitating the ethnic cleansing of the Rohingya Muslim minority. The report detailed how the platform's algorithms amplified dehumanizing and discriminatory content. For many people in Myanmar, Facebook was the entirety of the internet. Local military and extremist figures weaponized that monopoly to spread propaganda. The platform functioned as an accelerant for long-standing ethnic tensions, pouring fuel on the fire and increasing the outbreak of mass.
If the outcome is this destructive, the obvious question is how to intervene. Haider argues that we cannot distinguish between people and choose who is allowed to access social media. To do so would violate the core norms of democracy and human rights. We are trapped in a paradox. We mandate driving tests and licenses before allowing someone to operate a car because a vehicle is dangerous. Yet, if we require a license to speak or to read online, we cross the line into authoritarianism.
The tension between safety and free expression is the central dilemma of the digital age. Authoritarian regimes already use the excuse of public safety to shut down the internet, silence dissidents, and suppress political opposition. If a democratic government starts deciding who is qualified to use social media, they are creating a two-tiered society. Access to the internet is viewed as a fundamental human right by numerous international bodies. It is required for modern banking, accessing government services, and participating in the modern economy. You cannot restrict access based on an arbitrary measure of digital literacy without disenfranchising millions of vulnerable people.
But doing nothing leaves those same vulnerable people at the mercy of algorithmic manipulation and mob violence. If we accept that restriction is undemocratic, we must look at the responsibility of the platforms themselves. The companies building the cars are designing them to go faster without installing any brakes.
Platform accountability is where the focus must shift. For years, companies operated under the ethos of moving fast and breaking things. They built products for a Western context and deployed them globally without hiring enough local moderators who understood the language, culture, or historical context of the regions they were entering. When violence erupted in Sri Lanka in 2014, and again in subsequent years, the government repeatedly pointed to Facebook as an instigator of anti-Muslim mob violence. The platform lacked the linguistic capability and cultural context to identify and remove hate speech before it translated into physical harm.
We also need to address the economic realities of digital access in the global South. A significant portion of the population is navigating the digital world under strict data constraints, which reshapes how they consume information.
Data affordability plays a massive role in how information is consumed. In many developing nations, users purchase small, prepaid data packages. To capture this market, tech companies partner with local telecom providers to offer zero-rated access. This means accessing Facebook or WhatsApp does not count against the user's data limit, while clicking a link to an external news site or a fact-checking portal does cost money.
So the platform essentially becomes a walled garden. The user is financially penalized for seeking outside context.
The economic disincentive to fact-check is profound. If you receive an inflammatory headline on a zero-rated platform, verifying that claim requires you to spend your limited data allowance. Most people will not make that trade-off. They will consume the headline, accept it as truth, and forward it to their network. The financial architecture of digital access actively discourages the critical scrutiny Haider is calling for.
If we return to the analogy of the untrained driver, zero rating is the equivalent of paying for their petrol as long as they stay on the most dangerous, congested highway, while placing toll booths on all the safe exit routes. We have established that banning users is undemocratic, and relying solely on digital literacy is insufficient given the algorithms and the economics. What mechanisms actually disrupt this cycle?
Structural changes to the platforms themselves are the most effective intervention. WhatsApp introduced limits on how many times a message can be forwarded and the added labels to indicate when a message did not originate from the sender. These are friction points. They slow down the velocity of the rumor mill. Furthermore, governments and international bodies are beginning to demand algorithmic transparency. If a platform operates in a country, it should be required to demonstrate that it has sufficient moderation capabilities in the local languages and dialects. It cannot build the infrastructure for communication without building the infrastructure for safety.
These friction points seem like minor speed bumps rather than fundamental fixes. If the core business model relies on engagement and outrage drives engagement, limiting forwards is merely treating the symptom. The engine is still designed to run on the same volatile fuel.
That is the uncomfortable truth at the heart of Haider's essay. Unless the financial incentives of the tech industry change, the underlying danger persists. We are relying on the goodwill of corporations to police their own products, often after the damage has been done. The European Union has implemented the Digital Services Act, which forces large platforms to assess and mitigate systemic risks, including the spread of illegal content and the manipulation of fundamental rights. The challenge is extending that level of regulatory pressure to the global South, where individual nations may lack the market leverage to force compliance from multinational tech companies.
The power dynamic is deeply skewed. A tech giant can afford to ignore the regulatory demands of a smaller developing nation, or even threaten to pull its services entirely, which would cripple the local digital economy. Haider's sense of dread stems from this helplessness. Millions of people are caught between the vital utility of digital connectivity and the devastating consequences of its unchecked power. It is a stark reminder that the tools connecting the globe are also the tools fracturing its communities.
The analogy holds to the very end. The car is indispensable for modern life. We cannot return to a world without it, but we must urgently redesign the roads, enforce safety standards on the manufacturers, and recognize that handing over the keys without any safeguards is a dereliction of global responsibility.
It is an ongoing challenge that will define the political stability of the coming decades. Share this episode with a friend to keep the conversation going.